Welcome to another great episode of TCA Crossroads, where entrepreneurs and investors connect. I have with me my co-host, Dave Burkus, Chairman Emeritus of TCA, and I am David Friedman, TCA Venture Group. We welcome you. We hope this will be a very instructive and exciting podcast. At the last podcast, we had a discussion relating to what's important for entrepreneurs to consider as they make presentations to investors. And one of the things we talked about was the opportunity to share the CEO, the team, the board, and the governance of the company, and how all those things are really the most critical aspect to having a good, successful company. Today, Dave, you and I are going to be talking about, mostly you, going to be giving a 2-hour presentation on boards and board governance.
Don't go away, please. Don't go away. We're going to compress that down to 6 seconds.
Yeah, well, we're going to probably be somewhere between the two. This is going to be, if some of you may remember, a thing called the Classic Comics, where we took like James Joyce's Ulysses and Moby Dick. We brought that down into cartoon, 14 pages, and it was the essence of the book. In essence, we're going to do that today. But this is going to be important because it'll help set the stage for you making a company successful as an entrepreneur, and also will help the investors understand what's important in a board of advisors, and in the governance structure that makes it real critical, and the questions they should ask. So you're ready to take it over, right, Dave?
Any old time. They consider me an expert in board governance, and so I'm going to try and act like one. All right?
All right. Go for it.
Okay. So I have a couple of quotes. First of all, I met Yogi Berra in 1996. I talked to him, and he explained some of his things to me, as he's probably done 1,000,000 times to other people. But here's one. If you don't know where you're going, you'll wind up somewhere else, which is about boards, if you didn't realize it. Jamie Dimon of Chase Bank said CEOs can get fired for having merger talks and not informing the board. And Ken Chenault of American Express said one of the worst things you can do as a CEO is have a passive board. Now we're down to what we need to talk about. And finally, Andrew Wilson of Electronic Arts said boards aren't there to provide direction. They're there to provide perspective. And now I'm going to tell you why. So there are 3 stages of a board. Early stage, you start a company, you don't need investors until you need investors. And that's when it triggers third party, and the need for a board is usually dictated by their documents. And the boards are often stacked with investors, and I want you not to do that. So we need to have balance on the board, with management having a couple of seats, investors maybe at the start having a couple of seats, and the 4 of the people deciding who the best person in the industry that you can attract would be the 5th seat. And then finally, you get to the venture round. That's not our talk today, but that will be even more formal for a board. But that balance is really important, as we discussed just a moment ago. I would even add a lawyer if they're willing to be at the board meeting free. Some lawyers are, most of them aren't. And most of these meetings are monthly for early stage companies. After break even, sometimes quarterly. Most of mine are monthly and stay that way. What do board members do? Well, they provide and monitor resources for management. That's pretty good. But listen to this. They hire, manage, and replace the CEO. That's you. Oh, no. They approve executive compensation and all deferred compensation. Let me reiterate that one. You are being paid because the board agreed to your compensation. And any one of the employees, going all the way down to your lowest employee who gets a stock option, is going to have that option approved by the board before it's legal. And then now the things you expect, which is the board helps the CEO to shape strategy and vision and ensures the health of the organization. The boards are supposed to last for a long time, even if the members are changed. What do effective boards do? They provide strategic assets and a competitive advantage if you get the right board. They elevate the purpose, and they elevate your performance. And they focus on the main things and the right questions. And in a minute, I'll help you with that one too. And they partner with you. They're not trying to be on the opposite side of the table. They're trying to help you. And finally, they accept individual responsibility, but all together, a board is collectively responsible. Here are the questions I promised. There are three kinds of mindsets for board members, and these are important. You may not have heard the word of generative thinking before, and you may have, but here are the kinds of generative questions you as a good board member would ask. Ask why, or what if, or what are the alternatives, or is this idea on mission? Hmm. Ask strategic questions. Is this part of the competitive landscape? What is the competitive landscape? What's the PR impact? Does this idea move us toward our goal? And is this too little for too much money? And then the obvious things you expect a board to ask, fiduciary things like, is it legal, feasible, affordable, and sustainable? Really good questions. Think about these for a few seconds and don't think about what a typical board meeting does. Typically, a board meeting is passive. The people listen. The CEO makes a presentation, usually a slide deck. The board may or may not ask a couple of questions, make a few observations, and the board meeting is over. You know, your ability to think well in a board meeting doesn't go beyond 2 hours. Don't let the CEO, if you're the CEO, don't do it yourself, dominate a board meeting. Send the slide deck out 3 or 4 days in advance. Tell the board you want them to think with generative, strategic, and fiduciary questions, and that would make a good board meeting. But the ultimate reminder is to a board member, noses in, fingers out, meaning don't try and run the company. Don't reach beyond the CEO to even talk decision making to one of the vice presidents or anybody else without the CEO present. You're going to cut the CEO off at the knees if you do. Just don't do it. Remember, noses in, fingers out. So how do you pay an early stage board? Not with cash. That doesn't happen. Stock grants are taxable events, so not even by giving stock. You give them options. A typical board is paid 1%, each person is paid 1% vesting over 2 to 4 years. If they're a board member for a year, they're only going to get a quarter. In fact, sometimes we cliff those vestings. So if you're a board member for 11 months, you get nothing. And these, by the way, are non-qualified options. That means that they're taxed as ordinary income. And how do you do this? Well, you usually have one board meeting a month and maybe some phone time in between. If you're the chairman of the board, sometimes you can be offered and get about an additional 0.5% because you become the CEO's coach. And consulting fees may be okay, not really much, but they could be okay if more. And then there is a board of advisors that fills out the needs that the board members may not be able to have. Like if you're the CEO, you say, you know, I don't have a very high quality CFO, I have a controller. Why don't I find an advisor who can help me with some of the financial questions and duties, not actually performing them, but helping to get this controller up. So let's have an advisor. Let's have an advisor in marketing. Let's have one in board, not board building, on governance, but other words, you get the ideas. These people can come cheap and easy, but it creates a list of known names to help validate your vision. And it allows for a convenient way to move people off the board. You can just move them into the advisory board. They won't be quite as unhappy if they're told that. Well, how do you pay an advisory board? Well, same thing, stock options, but now they're about a quarter of the amount of a board member because there's no governance responsibility, no liability. So 1/4%, 0.5% if you have a big name. And these are the same, non-qualified, which means they're taxed at ordinary income when they're exercised. And by the way, that means if you sell the company and all these options become vested, those people are going to pay ordinary income on the sale unless they actually exercise their options 5 years earlier or 1 year earlier than the sales event. Then they can be capital gains. So what do you expect an advisor? Well, maybe a couple of phone calls a month or a couple of visits a year. And if more, consulting fees are appropriate. Okay. And so it is also okay to bring some advisors into board meetings as observers. They can't vote. And you can tell them to leave for executive sessions, but you can bring them in if they have expertise that helps the board. So here are the final thoughts. On balance, boards require time to nurture and grow in usefulness. I love to have a personal dinner meeting before the first board meeting. After that, you can meet by Zoom. I don't care. But you've got to get this board to gel, and you don't do it when everything is by Zoom and you've never met the person before. So time is well spent when crises hit, and crises do hit. So if you have a board that gels because they have known each other and they're comfortable with each other, that's going to help you as a CEO getting over this. CEOs are often isolated without a board, and they need the help most when they have a good board. And you know that no one CEO can do it all. We all know that. But who does the CEO talk to? You don't talk to somebody who you've hired, you've employed. If you've got a problem, you really want to talk to somebody who is vested, but not necessarily worried about whether or not you're going to fire them. And boards create credibility for fundraising and the ultimate liquidity event. And there's a lot to say about that, but not today. So some final thoughts again. When something happens, the first question is, where was the board? That's why this is an important presentation, isn't it, David? And
That's
finally,
correct.
the $64 million question, is the board adding as much value to the company as it could? Wow. That's it. That was 2 hours in 11 minutes and 30 seconds, David.
Yeah, so that engenders just a lot of questions, at least in my
That's
mind.
the idea.
I remember, I have several. I remember using a board when I was at US Cellular, and I would bring them into the strategy meetings. We had strategic offsites because the most critical thing is I wanted a variety and diversity of thought. I wanted perspective on my strategy. I didn't really care as much about the compensation, although obviously if we screwed up, I would probably be unemployed quickly.
You would have been, yes.
Yeah, I would have been, right. But I thought it was important to bring them in because then they can also understand not only the outcome, but the thinking process that went involved. And that became really critical. But I do have a couple of questions based upon your presentation. Number one, you mentioned that NSO options are taxed as ordinary income. However, that's when they exercise the option, not at the grant of the option, correct?
That is so important. The answer is yes. It's when you exercise. If
Okay.
somebody were given stock, they have to pay income tax at the price that stock was worth at the point when they're given the stock. Most people
Okay.
don't know that, but the IRS in an audit would find that right away.
And that had changed from the early days up in the valley when they were granted options that were taxed at that time in income. That's why I want to make that distinction. And then when they had to pay taxes on this grant, but then what happened when the company went belly up? They had no recourse. They just lost money.
Exactly.
So that's
Which
why
is
the
why,
NSOs are critical.
also why very few people exercise their options until there's an M&A event or a public
Correct.
offering.
Yeah. And then you can do what they call a cashless transaction sometime if you're really lucky. You just take it as income and not just own the paper, because when you exercise an option, you usually have to pay that strike price.
So can I help everybody with that? Because you're
Sure.
very right. Almost everybody does cashless transactions. It is at the option of the board. You could say no cashless transactions allowed, and you
That's
can do
true.
that just in the option agreement with each individual. However, everybody does. They allow it. So let's say that you had 100 shares, but the cost of those shares was equal to 25 shares. What happens is we take the 25 shares as if they were cash, and you are paid 75 shares worth of value.
Correct. Yeah. So that makes it a lot more palatable for people, especially if you have a lot of options. I'll say if I'm granted, I'm in a very big startup and I get 100,000 shares of, of options, and all of a sudden the option's exercisable at $2.
Yep.
You know,
It could be
the
a lot
other
of
thing,
money. And
yeah. So
the
another
taxes,
question. Sorry, go ahead.
it could be a lot of money, and the taxes will be a lot higher, a lot higher. They will be higher than capital gains. Capital gains are long term only if you hold it for a year. So you have to exercise this option and wait a year. If you
Correct.
wait until the M&A event, you haven't done that. And so therefore you're going to pay ordinary income tax rates on those shares.
Now, what happens? Is there a correlation with the 1022 transaction? Because if now I exercise the option, okay, I own the shares. And then if I wait 5 years, I can get the 1022.
No, it's 1202. But yes,
Oh, 1202. I don't know what it's 1022 for. I
I'm
marked
your
it down.
legal expert for the day.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Sorry about
Uh-huh.
that.
1202 requires several things. It must be a C Corp. It must be original issue. You can't have bought it from somebody else.
But you can still
The
do it if you
company,
have the option, right? If I'm
no,
granted
you
an
have to have
NSO
exercised
option.
the option 5 years earlier.
Say that
So think
again?
about it. You have to
Okay,
exercise it 5 years earlier than the event to gain
correct,
1202.
correct. So if I
But
were
you
to
could,
gain, and if I had an NSO option today and I granted 100,000 shares, I paid for the shares, I could have to wait 5 years and then I would have the 1202.
yes, wait one
Okay,
year and you get long-term capital gain,
got
which
it.
is becoming less and less valuable as the government keeps increasing capital
Yeah,
gains taxes. But still, there
or if
is
you
some.
live in California, whichever of the two comes first, you know.
Can I
So,
talk about that for a second? Just for a
go ahead,
second.
go ahead.
California reduced, first of all, the 1202, which they called 502, to 50% from 100% deferred or lost. So you don't have to pay any
Well,
tax
right.
federal. So 50%, that was a slap in the face. And then they further said, well, we'll just make it plain capital gains, no matter what. That was a slap in the face. Then they said, no, let's just call it ordinary income and make capital gains and ordinary income the same number. The state of California stinks. I didn't mean that. The
Yeah, but
state of California doesn't
hold on.
help.
We're not making political statements today about California, but you still get, but it still helps you on the federal return, which is the big bucket.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah. So let me ask you one final question before we have to close out this. Now, we hear all the time that an investor says, if I'm going to put money in, I want a board seat. And if I don't get a board seat, I want a board observer seat. How important is that to an investor?
To an investor. Oh, I was waiting for the other side of that. How important is
Ah,
that to the
well, you can
CEO?
answer both questions. You can answer both sides.
Okay, so the CEO says, oh boy, I need your money, but my board's already full, or you're not the kind of person I need. You wouldn't say that, but that would be in the
Oh, yeah, you
mindset.
would.
Okay. And then you have a problem. Uh, Early stage CEOs accepting their first round of professional investments, the document will say that the investor, not the CEO, gets to pick the board member or board members. In some cases, TCA fund has had 2 board members out of 5. And so remember I talked about balance on the board? Two,
Right.
2, and 1. And those 2 could be members of TCA fund at the very beginning, and then 2 from management. It would be the founder and maybe 2 founders, or the founder and somebody else the founder trusts. And together the 4 should, if this is done right, pick the 5th one. Now, I said that before. I just want to repeat it again. But what if the investor says, I must be on the board as an individual? You got a problem. I'm not going to try and solve it for you right now, but that is a problem.
Yeah. So what we try to do in our term sheets and in our discussions is early on make that determination if in fact we can get a board or board observer seat. Now, the good news is even with a board observer seat, and I'm on a couple of boards like that as a board observer, the CEO is really good about letting us engage. We don't just sit there just watching. We actually have interactivity. And I think that again, it goes back to perspective. It goes back to diversity of thought. And we've actually been able to help the CEO, even though it's just a board observer seat. But I think it's really important. A lot of my colleagues think it's important. And we look at that in the term sheet. So from an investor point of view, put it into the term sheet early on in the negotiation so there's no surprises. And all of a sudden you find out, hey, no board seat or no board observer seat. And from the CEO perspective, figure out who you want on the board. What are the right characteristics to complement the operational team and to complement the existing board or board observer members. So
Can I add to that? Yes,
sure.
the CEO or the chairman of the board. Chairman of the board is supposed to determine the way in which a board meeting is run and the agenda. That doesn't happen. It happens the CEO usually does that. But let's say legally the chairman is supposed to do it. The chairman can say at any time, okay, executive session. Everybody who is not a member of this board must leave. And that means the secretary, if the secretary of the corporation is taking minutes, has to go. If it means the lawyer, you usually have the lawyer say because of attorney-client privilege, therefore no problem. And every one of those advisors has to go.
Yeah.
And then you have your executive session. So it's always a tool available to the chairman.
And with that information, I hope this has been really instructive for many of the listeners. Either you're an investor, you've learned what you really need to look for, what you need to ask, what the perspective you should bring to the table. For the entrepreneur, what you need in a board, why the board is so critical. So with that, Mr. Burkus, this is a wrap.
2 hours and 20 minutes. You got it.
All right. So we're going to close it and we'll see you next time. Everybody have a great day.